But here we are. So, first lecture we kind of zeroed in on Virginia and its origins and development. Second lecture we moved north to New England and looked at those colonies and their origins and development. And now we're going to kind of broaden it out and look at all 13 of Britain's mainland North American colonies. And I'll start saying Britain instead of England, because by this time England and Scotland had come together to form the United Kingdom of Great Britain. And we will talk about Britain's system of mercantilism and how that develops and the role that the colonies play in that and where they fit into in this concept of the Atlantic world. We'll define mercantilism, we'll define Atlantic world, and we'll kind of break the colonies up into 3 regions and go from there. First, broad trends. And I didn't say this, but it's in the title. I mean, we've moved into the 18th century, the 1700s. And kind of trace some broad trends in these 13 colonies in the early to mid 1700s or 18th century. Population growth and economic development. Population growth, economic development. In terms of population growth, and you don't have to memorize these numbers ever. Well, I guess you don't have to memorize anything, being as we're open book these days. But in 1700, there were about 250,000 people in the colonies. 250,000. By 1770, on the eve of the American Revolution, there are over 2 million. So that's from 250,000 to over 2 million. That's 8 times as many, 800% growth. About 75% of that, 3/4 of that, comes from natural increase, meaning we are far beyond those early starving times. And people are living much longer. Infants are surviving infancy. People are procreating. And the population is just naturally growing. That being said, that leaves a full 25%, quarter of this population growth, to immigration. People newly arrived to these colonies during this period. And it makes, in some places at least, the colonies a lot more diverse. About 30%, though, of immigrants into the colonies during this period are people we call the Scots-Irish. Long story short, the English had for centuries tried to dominate the Irish. At one point, giving land to loyal Scottish Presbyterians in the north of Ireland to displace the native Irish, who remained staunchly Catholic themselves. And over time, those Scottish people in the north of Ireland, which remains to this day part of the United Kingdom, they become Irish themselves, but they have these Scottish roots, and they're Protestant, they're Presbyterian. The Scots-Irish. Irish of Scottish descent who are Protestant, and not native Irish Catholic. That constitutes about 30% of the immigrants into the colonies during this period. Another 15% come from the German territories of Central Europe. As I do have a map up there, and as I've said in here before, I take nothing for granted when it comes to geography, but this is Europe. These are the British Isles. That's Ireland there. So it's the 6 counties in the north here that the British actually controlled then and continue to control now, where the Scots-Irish are. England is down here on the island of Britain. Scotland is here. About 10%, by the way, of immigrants to the colonies during this period are Scottish, like Scottish from Scotland. Here's France, there's Italy, and here are or the German territories, there was no unified Germany at the time, as there is today. But this area of Central Europe constitutes an ethnically homogeneous German-speaking, culturally German region, and about 15% of immigrants to the colonies during this time come from there. There's another big chunk here. 30% of immigrants into the colonies during this time don't come from anywhere on that map of Europe. Where might you guess I am talking about? It too is a very large and not unified and diverse continent. And when I say up there two types of immigration, maybe I can help you towards this when I say there's voluntary immigration, where you choose whether you're Scots, Irish, Scottish, or German to come to America. And then there's involuntary immigration, where you were brought by force and violence to America. So where am I talking about? Africa. 30% of people brought into, or coming into the colonies during this period are brought in a state of enslavement from various parts of West and Southwest and Southeast Africa. From Ghana and Congo and Benin and Angola and Mozambique. Mostly to the southern colonies to grow cash crops, as we'll see. The upshot is that by 1770, only half of the colonists in America were of English descent. We are a nation of immigrants, both voluntary and involuntary. In terms of economic development, the colonists continue to encroach upon, seize, occasionally purchase, or otherwise acquire Indian land, driving Native Americans for the most part beyond the Appalachian Mountains and expanding their settlement. You cannot grow by 800%, bring in all those many people and not grow your physical footprint. So here you can see the spread of white settlement and the South, the growth of slavery as well. Of course, you see in yellow would be enslaved persons from Africa or from the existing slave colonies, sometimes in the Caribbean. The green is English, purple German. A lot of them are up here in Pennsylvania and New York. I didn't mention the Dutch, but of course there remains a lot of Dutch people in the Hudson River Valley and in New York. Blue is Scots Irish. A lot of them end up down here in the Carolinas and Virginia. And the orange Scottish, the same, Carolinas. But that shows you the growth of settlement. Depending on which region we're looking at, as we'll see, these look a little bit different, both population growth and economic development. I'm going to split the colonies into 3 regions, as your textbook does. These are not like official administrative regions. This is just a way of saying, hey, these colonies are a little bit similar, and these are. New England, you already know, constitutes a sort of unique region where there will be, as I alluded to at the end of the last lecture, commercial development, growth of trade, increased exports of raw materials, growth of cities, most especially Boston, Massachusetts. Further south, the middle colonies like New York and Pennsylvania, somewhat of the same, commercial development, growth of cities, but also agricultural production in the form of wheat. And then in the southern colonies, of course, it's all about chattel slavery and cash crops and exporting tobacco and rice, which would be among the most valuable goods traded in the so-called Atlantic world. Each of these colonies in these 3 regions will have something that they export out into the Atlantic world market, and we'll look individually at each region and see what are those goods. But first, let us try to understand what is this Atlantic world. So the Atlantic world would include, of course, the Atlantic Ocean, but also all of the areas on its periphery. So that would include, of course, the 13 North American colonies. That would include the Caribbean colonies, and it would include Latin America, Spanish America, and Portuguese Brazil, and it would include East and South, or West and Southwest Africa. That would include Western Europe and, of course, Britain. All of these are a part of the Atlantic world. Cities from London to Boston to Kingston, Jamaica. Port cities especially, part of the Atlantic world. The ships going back and forth across the ocean, part of the Atlantic world. The goods and the people that they carry. The ideas that they bring back and forth, all part of the Atlantic world. Those persons held in slavery, laboring in the colonies of the New World, part of the Atlantic world. Their people and their ancestors back in Benin and Ghana and Angola, part of the Atlantic world. This is a scholarly concept, a way of adjusting our thinking where we don't just think, well, I'm a historian who specializes in American history. I'm a historian who specializes in West African history. Now, history departments have specialists in the Atlantic world who are familiar with and studies of all of these places and their intimate connections. Today, I'm, at this point at least, primarily concerned with trade in the Atlantic world, though it is about much more than that. For example, our next lecture will concern ourselves very much with the ideas going back and forth across the Atlantic. But if we're looking at trade and what's being imported and exported, what are the things? So, from America, we already know, from the southern colonies, it's the cash crops of tobacco and rice. From the middle colonies, it's wheat. Do you remember at the end of the last lecture when I said New England, those colonies will eventually export fill in the blank? What was it? I was saying, you know, the Puritan church declines in terms of influence, and trade becomes a faith, and merchants will become wealthy and influential, and this region will eventually export these raw materials like timber, fish. And some of that will go to the south, to the Caribbean colonies, as you can see reflected on that map. Some of it, a lot of it will go back home to Britain. In the case of cash crops, almost all of it. Coming out of Britain, manufactured goods. What's the difference between raw materials or cash crops on the one hand and then manufactured goods on the other? Manufactured goods are things that are made. We're talking raw materials or commodities. Those are things that either you harvest from nature, like timber or fish, or things that you plant and grow and cultivate, like wheat, tobacco, rice, etc. Manufactured goods are things that are made. So what in the colonies at that time would constitute manufactured goods? Firearms would be one. Guns. Say?
Cloth.
Clocks?
Cloth.
Cloth. Yeah, both. Clocks and cloth. So I'll broaden that out. Textiles, linens, clothing, yes. But also clocks. Books, furniture, tools, implements, a tea set, dinnerware, I mean, all kinds of things. The colonies do very little making of those things. They don't do a lot of manufacturing. That's by design. It's the role of colonies to benefit back home in Europe, mother countries. And I want to stress here that Britain's not the only one building this kind of what we'll define as a mercantilist empire. Spain, you know, has colonies. France has colonies. The Netherlands and the Dutch have colonies. Portugal, and so on. If you're one of those mother countries, your colonies are like your children. They're supposed to benefit you by providing you with raw materials and purchasing your manufactured goods. They're what we call a captive market. They have to buy your manufactured goods. At least you're going to put in place a system that will compel them to buy your manufactured goods and to not do much manufacturing on their own. From West Africa, you see the continued export of gold and ivory, but increasingly in the 1700s of human property, slaves. In fact, remember what I said chattel slavery means, a system in which slaves are considered property. And in the Atlantic world, the most valuable commodity of all are slaves. From the Caribbean, you know it's all about sugar cane. But also, byproduct of sugarcane sugar production, you take the sugar cane, you squeeze out the juice, you spin out the crystals that become table sugar, and the gooey, thick liquid left over is molasses, which becomes a commodity in its own right. And there are some other things listed on there because of the fuzziness of the projector you probably cannot read, and that's fine. We will get to those things in due course when we zero in on each of these three regions. But first, let's define mercantilism. It's all about controlling trade, creating a closed system of trade, if you will. But it is an economic system at its core that predates capitalism. In fact, you guys familiar, would you know if I said, well, who's like the father, who's considered the intellectual father of capitalism, our current global economic system? Scottish, his name's Adam Smith. He writes like the influential seminal work that sort of lays out what capitalism should be. And I bring it up now because in doing so, he coins the term mercantilism by looking back on this period and saying this was not the way to do it. This is not how you generate wealth. It was a derogatory ex post facto term, that is after the fact term, looking back to describe this period. And this economic system, here's your definition, in which nations seek to regulate foreign trade, an economic system in which nations seek to regulate foreign trade in order to accumulate wealth. You regulate foreign trade with the purpose of accumulating, gathering up wealth. And I'd add on to that, an economic system driven by competition with other nations. Characterized by competition with other nations, not cooperation, in which nations seek to regulate foreign trade or control it with the purpose of accumulating wealth. I want to break that down. In capitalism, generally speaking, nations prefer free trade with one another. The idea is that free trade benefits everyone. In mercantilism, it was the exact opposite. It was about tightly controlling and restricting trade with other nations. In capitalism, if you make money, if you're a firm or a corporation, a company, you make money, what do you do with that money? Why do we call it capitalism? What do you do with capital? Do you just hoard it, accumulate it, put it under a mattress and store it away? Why is it easier to get more rich if you're already rich? It takes money to make money. That's what you do with money. You make more money with it. That's not what's happening here. These nations are hoarding up and accumulating wealth because this is a great competition, as I said, mercantilism is. It's the great game for establishing colonial empires and seeing who can get more colonies, more raw materials, sell more manufactured goods, export more to other countries than you import from them, to have a positive trade balance with other nations. Because in this great competition, everyone could foresee that there was some great war coming somewhere down the road. In fact, there are a series of wars between these mother countries, European nations, culminating in one single great war that I'm going to talk about at the beginning of the next lecture. In the sort of late middle of the 1700s. And when I say one final thing about accumulating wealth, I mean in the form of specie. Not species, but specie. You may know what that means? Gold and silver, especially gold and silver used as coin, or in bulk or in bullion, money of the day, before there was paper money. Gold and silver are finite resources, meaning there's only so much of them in the world. Therefore, if you're one of these mother countries, if you're Britain, you're thinking more gold and silver for me is less for my enemies. More gold and silver accumulated by Great Britain is less for Spain or France. Of course, they are thinking the very same thing, and this becomes that great competition. But you want to be, if that great war between everyone pops off, you want to be in the best position to build the best army and the best navy, and navies are expensive to build, to be able to win that war. And your colonies ought to work to your benefit in that way. By providing you with raw materials, by purchasing your manufactured goods, as we'll see, paying their taxes, particularly in form of tariffs. Tariffs are one of the ways in which you could establish a mercantilist system. And to create between you, the mother country, and your colonies this sort of closed-off system of trade that I alluded to. Let's just take, for example, sugar. So if you're Britain, you've got islands in the Caribbean where slave labor produces sugar and molasses, including Jamaica and Barbados. They export that sugar and molasses back to Britain, but also to the mainland 13 colonies in America. Especially to Boston, Massachusetts, where colonists there import that molasses to distill it and turn it into rum, which they then sell into the Atlantic world market. If you're the British government, if you're the king and parliament, you want those Bostonian rum makers to be buying their molasses from Barbados and Jamaica, not from Haiti or Curacao or Cuba, because those are other countries' colonies. Does that make sense? How do you do that, though? You don't have to just pass a law that says you absolutely can't do that. Colonists might not like that. So what you do is you put a nominal tiny little tax on the importation of British molasses from those British colonies, and then you slap a much bigger tax on molasses or sugar from French and Spanish and Dutch colonies, making that stuff cost more so that theoretically those Bostonian rum makers would be buying their stuff from other British colonies. Does that make sense? As we will see, there will be problems with this. For example, what happens if those rum makers say, well, even if we pay the tiny tax on the British stuff, it's too much, it'll make our rum too expensive and nobody will buy it. We'll get pushed out of the market. So what we're going to do is bribe customs officials and smuggle in Dutch and French molasses and nobody will know about it. And if Parliament's not paying attention for 10, 20, 30 years, we might just roll with that for a while. Until, as we'll see, Parliament does pay attention to it. Enacting taxes like that, that would be done by law, by Parliament, and that would be an example of a Navigation Act. A Navigation Act for laws passed by Parliament that established the mercantilist system. Laws passed by Parliament that established the mercantilist system. For example, by enacting small taxes on stuff within the empire and bigger taxes on outside goods. Now, in the case of certain of the most valuable cash crops, which would include sugar, and as you hopefully know by now, tobacco and rice. British Parliament actually does say, okay, those are special, those constitute enumerated goods. Enumerated just means like a numeral numbered list, 1, 2, 3. And Parliament says those special enumerated goods, those three especially, can only be sold to Britain or to another British colony. If you're a planter who has slaves producing those three valuable cash crops, sugar, tobacco, rice, your initial sale can only be into a British port back in Britain itself or to another British colony. In other words, you can't sell or export your sugar, tobacco, or rice to a French colony or to France or to a Spanish colony or to Spain. Now look, eventually, because I said you do want to export to other countries more than you import, merchants in Britain could then, as a second sale, sell things like processed tobacco to France or elsewhere on the European mainland to make money. But it had to be funneled first through a British port, where, of course, it could be taxed and processed. Now, they do the same with manufactured goods. They don't tell their colonists, hey, you can't buy manufactured goods ever from any other country. What they say is, if you're going to buy manufactured goods from some other country, they must first pass through a British port. Why? So they can be taxed, right? And then they'll cost more, and it's the same as with the sugar. The thinking is, well, people won't want to buy French or Dutch manufactured goods if they cost more, they'll buy British. Or if they're filthy rich, like if they're a tobacco planter like Thomas Jefferson, and they're building a plantation home, and they believe the best glass windows are produced in Paris, France, and they want to buy an expensive-ass French glass window, okay, they'll pay the higher price, and it's been taxed, and the British government makes money and accumulates wealth from the taxation. So it's a win-win, they're thinking. Either colonists will buy British, or if they don't, we'll accumulate money off the tax that's placed on whatever non-British good. And in addition to these kinds of laws, regulating the exportation of cash crops and other raw materials, regulating the importation of manufactured goods, there are laws passed to regulate shipping that say, for example, only British ships can do business in British colonial ports. And all British ships have to have at least a 3/4 British crew. We don't want our merchant ships' captains, staffing their crews, filling their crew out with French subjects or Spanish subjects or whatever. All of these would constitute navigation acts. Questions about any of these? Any of that?
Can you talk about the shipping one more time, please?
Shipping? Yeah, they pass a handful of laws that regulate shipping that say, for example, only British ships, like British flag ships, can do business in British colonial ports. They didn't want French and Spanish merchants, Dutch merchants sailing to, Savannah, New York, Boston, and peddling their goods or benefiting from purchasing British colonial raw materials. And in addition to that, they also stipulate that British merchant ships had to have at least a 75% or 3/4, in other words, British crew. They need to be British subjects working on these ships because they wanted full employment for their merchant marine, their sailors. Other question?
Could you say where the mother countries again?
So what would be the major mother countries? Obviously Britain is one. These are the ones who are building or have built at this point colonial empires. Who else? Who else? France? Spain, yes. Portugal, the Netherlands, the Dutch. All these countries that over the preceding 200 years had come to the New World, murdered, enslaved, or pushed off their lands Native Americans, made colonies out of those lands, in many cases brought people from Africa in to work in those lands. And I should say, and this will be clear, I think, now that I've added in recent semesters some maps. In the case of some of these mother countries, they don't just have colonies in the New World. A lot of them have established colonies in Asia as well. A lot of them have port cities that they have forcibly taken control of from the Chinese. The British had colonized a substantial portion by this point of India, the Indian subcontinent here. The Dutch had forcibly taken control of much of the East Indies. The Spanish had control of the Philippines. The French had put a toehold in Southeast Asia, where Vietnam is. So these mother countries, some of them have built not just New World empires, but global colonial empires. Which allows a country like Britain to not just sell into its American colonies manufactured goods, but also, and to tax those, but also, is there a commodity that you can think of that occupies a prominent place in the lore of American revolutionary history that was not produced in America, that the British government taxed, and that the colonists got pissed off about said tax? Tea from India. So there are raw materials from other parts of the empire that can be sold into the American colonies too, and by proxy it works the other way too. You can sell into India goods produced in America. And this shows you kind of the mercantilist world economy, and then subsequently, I think, there's a map for each mother country. This would be the British world empire, and you can see Britain itself. Britain has the Hudson Bay colony up here above French Canada. They've got islands, as you know, in the Caribbean. They have points of contact in Latin America and West Africa. As I said, they control a large portion by that time of India, and they have port cities like Hong Kong in southeastern China. I think, if you click the link, you'd be able to see like Spain's global empire, France, and the Netherlands, and so on, but I took them out. There's a map on the left showing you the growth of colonial settlement. By 1700, where we kind of left off in the last two lectures, it was limited to those areas in brown. By 1770, as I had alluded to earlier, they have pushed Native Americans beyond or into the Appalachian Mountains and have more or less settled everything between those and the coast. And you have three kind of broad regions here. You have New England, which we've looked at up there. Down here we've looked at Virginia and alluded to other of the southern colonies like the Carolinas and Georgia, but also Maryland. And then you have the middle colonies in between that, which would be New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. And depending on which region you're looking at, if you go back to those two broad trends of population growth and economic development, those look a little bit different, depending on which region. So first, New England, including Massachusetts, as you know, which had subsumed or taken into itself Plymouth. And then, as you know, breaking off from Massachusetts, we had Rhode Island and Connecticut, and then we added to that New Hampshire. In terms of the economy here, it's still a lot of small family farms, which is what it was from the beginning. So they're not producing, an abundance of any crop that they're exporting. But they are, by this time, exporting a lot of fish, which could be salted down to preserve it and sold, a lot of it across the Atlantic back to Britain, but some of it down to the southern colonies. You don't have to think about the colonies as one, either importing or exporting, fill in the blank. They could trade with one another too. And if you consider that much of the land in the southern North American colonies is being used, as in the Caribbean, for growing past crops, those colonies might be importers of food, including fish. So some of that fish goes to the southern American colonies, some of it goes to the Caribbean colonies. And then timber. Consider the Atlantic world. It would not exist if it weren't for ships. And ships of the day are made of wood. And by that time, there's not a lot of forest land for harvesting timber to make wood for building ships. But there's plenty of it in the areas and the lands that you've taken from the Indians, and especially in New England, which becomes a major exporter of timber. Much of it going back to Britain to be used in shipbuilding. And anywhere you have timber cultivation, there are byproducts of that, just as there is with molasses and the production of sugar. Among the byproducts of timber cultivation would be tar and what they call pitch, from which we get the phrase, it's pitch black in here. These are used in shipbuilding to make vessels seaworthy, to seal between wooden planks and to coat the wood. Tar and pitch, turpentine. These are referred to as naval stores. Stores here is not like I'm going to go to the store. It's as in I have a store or storage of something, a quantity of something. Naval stores, tar and pitch used in shipbuilding. Those are exported as well. And that would be going back over to Britain to be used in the shipbuilding industry. Obviously, with this growth in trade, merchants will rise. I alluded to this at the end of the Puritan lecture, saying, by the time we get into this next lecture here, the power of the church has dramatically declined, and merchants have become the big power brokers. It's no longer the John Winthrops and John Wilsons of New England. Merchants, especially in the city of Boston. Check it out. Can you tell what that's from? Quite a day when my cursory internet searching, and in doing so, the best image of colonial 18th century Boston I could find is a screenshot from Assassin's Creed. But those people do their homework, man, I'm telling you. So that's a pretty good rendering of what, 1760s Boston may well look like. And that one city, in these regions, in this particular region, I should say, when we go to the middle colonies, it'll be a couple of different cities, southern colonies, a couple of different cities. For New England, it's Boston. That's the major, we call it an entrepot, a go-between, where goods are coming in and goods are going out and people are coming in and coming out. It's the busy port city that's the heart of that region. As we'll see after quiz 1 in the next lecture, it also becomes the heart of the American Revolution. In terms of population, of the 3 regions, this is the one where it remains largely English. Insofar as there are immigrants during this period to this region, and they're mostly English, so it doesn't become as diverse as elsewhere. You could speculate as to reasons why it could be the sort of intolerance of the Puritan church, as I said before, casting that long shadow that it does even after the demise of church power. But trade has become the new faith, I think I'd said before. Just below those New England colonies, we have Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Delaware. We call these the middle colonies. Here, too, it's a lot of small family farms. You don't have a lot of big plantations, and you don't have a lot of slaves. Insofar as there are slaves, and this goes for New England as well, they're mostly working as domestic servants in households in the cities. So it's mostly small family farms, but on aggregate, all together, they are producing a lot of wheat, which merchants will collect from those small family farms and export out into the Atlantic world market. Just as with the fish from New England, a lot of that could go to Britain, but too, it could go to the southern colonies or the Caribbean colonies. For wheat can be used to make flour. And flour, as you know, can be used for all sorts of things. There's commercial development here too. It's not just agricultural production in the form of wheat and the exportation of that wheat. A couple of big cities in this region. New York City is probably the obvious one. A port city that the English had seized from the Dutch. But, and today, look, if you know American cities, you probably know that New York City has for a long time been America's largest city. Very cosmopolitan city, heart of global finance and so on. It was not so at the time. In fact, there's another city in the middle colonies that was bigger than New York at the time, more important, and in fact was the second largest city in the entire British Empire, second only to London itself. You know what it was? To the west of New York, on the other side of, across New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Philadelphia. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the largest city in the colonies. Along with Boston, it will be a hub in later decades, as we'll see, of what would become revolutionary activity. It, for a time, would serve as the young American nation's capital. Home to influential colonists like Ben Franklin. In later years, a hub of abolitionist activity during the years leading up to the American Civil War. And only really overtaken by New York in the age of industrialization later in the 1800s. In terms of population trends here, much more diverse. A lot of immigrants from areas other than England. A lot of immigrants from the German states. A lot of immigrants from Northern Ireland or Scotland. So a much more colonial look, a much more diverse look than you would see in New England. They came to refer to a group of folks who, you know, in the area of wheat production would become great brewers and pretzel makers and the like, as the Pennsylvania Deutsche, or Dutch rather, Pennsylvania Dutch, which are not actually Dutch because what that originally was is Pennsylvania Deutsche, which is the German word for German. So a lot of, all that just to underscore a lot of German immigrants to these middle colonies. Question? And then there are the southern colonies. Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, and Georgia. Here, economic development, population growth, law, society, culture, all of it is informed by, affected by, rests upon a foundation of chattel slavery. These southern colonies become what historians refer to as a slave society, as opposed to what historians would call a society with slaves. That's what you had in the Middle and New England colonies. A society where, yes, slavery exists, but mostly in the form of domestic servants, not central to economy or society. But in the South, slavery is everything. Slavery informs in some way every aspect of life in these southern colonies. Their economies rest almost exclusively upon cash crop production. If we're talking about the upper South of Maryland and Virginia and North Carolina, the cash crop that they are producing is, of course, tobacco. If we're talking about the lower south and the low country along the coast outside of cities like Savannah and Charleston, it's rice. The lower south is South Carolina and Georgia, which did not include at that time the part of this state where we now sit, or the city of Atlanta did not exist. But that's what's being produced, that's what's being exported. In terms of the tobacco, most of that is going back over to Britain. And remember, it's an enumerated good, a special good that could not be sold out of these colonies to any other country or its colonies. Though it could, once it had passed through the hands of merchants in Britain itself, be sold then as finished product elsewhere in the European continent or in the world. In terms of the rice, that could go either back to Britain or to other colonies, particularly in the Caribbean. And then, of course, as I said earlier, the most valuable commodity in the Atlantic world are the slaves themselves that are, for the most part, coming into these colonies at the time, both directly from parts of West and Southwest and sometimes Southeast Africa, but sometimes too from the slave colonies in the Caribbean. There's a lively trade in slaves from the Caribbean colonies into the mainland colonies. If you look at this map here, insofar as you can see it, there's a few other things on here. So up here you got the green leaves, that's tobacco, of course. And look, you know, you weren't always just growing or producing these major exports. Of course, you raise livestock, so there's little piggies on there. And, you know, corn was grown all throughout the colony, mostly for internal use. What else do we got on here? Down here you got these bundles which represent rice. What else is that? What does that represent right there, that little blue bucket? In there too. There's a sort of secondary cash crop that's grown in the Low Country. Indigo. Indigo is used as a dye in textile production. And how about up here in North Carolina with the barrels, the hogsheads? Represents naval stores, which we talked about. Those are an export of New England as well. Well, New England's not the only region that produces timber. Got a lot of that from the Carolinas too, which if you follow college sports or have any inclination to go to the University of North Carolina, you might be aware that their sports teams are known as the Tar Heels. And so, you know, tar and pitch were at one time major exports from colony of North Carolina. We'll talk for a minute about the Atlantic slave trade. This map shows you some nuance. First of all, the continent of Africa is enormous. It is the birthplace of civilizations, the first human beings from East Africa and the Horn over here where Ethiopia is. Of course, civilization of ancient Egypt, a part of this northern African region, which is historically, ethnically, religiously different from other parts of Africa that lie below the largest desert in the world, the Sahara Desert. Below that is what we call sub-Saharan Africa. A great percentage of slaves come from this area here known as West Africa that's below the Sahara Desert on the western side. From places over here like Senegambia and Sierra Leone. From areas below what had been recently the great empires of Mali and Songhai along the West African coast, like here the Bight of Benin, B-I-G-H-T, means a curvature in the coast. And from areas to the west of that, like what were known as the Gold Coast or the Ivory Coast, the Côte d'Ivoire as the French called it. And from Ghana here. Or further south from the Congo and Angola below that. And down around here in Southeast Africa, as I've alluded to, from Mozambique. And above that, the great port islands and cities like Zanzibar. Here, above the Sahara Desert to the north and northeast and towards the Middle East, that is the Arab Muslim part of the world and have been for hundreds of years, which African slavers had sold across the Sahara Desert through the desert and trading towns like Timbuktu, slaves in centuries past. Not in any huge number, and for the most part were those slaves in the Arab Muslim world would become domestic servants. Oftentimes when they were at war with one another, African kingdoms would take prisoners and make those prisoners slaves who would then be integrated into village life in some way. But then Europeans arrived, mostly initially interested in things like ivory and gold, but beginning with the Portuguese, they become interested in some of those slaves. And the Portuguese thought, well, we Europeans only have ports along these coastlines. And we trade with African traders. But here the Portuguese had taken two little islands known as Sao Tome and Principe. And their theory was, we have to get sugar from all the way the hell over here in India. But this climate and this soil here is similar to that. Couldn't we grow sugarcane ourselves? But hey, actually, we don't really want to do that backbreaking labor ourselves. Why don't we purchase from our merchants here some of these slaves that they've taken captives of war and use them to grow the sugarcane? And the Portuguese, in their minds, that worked so well for them. They, in a sort of international accident, which I won't go into the details of, they also get to colonize down here Brazil. All this is Spanish, but this Brazil becomes a Portuguese colony. And then they're like, oh shit, we got a lot more land than just two tiny little islands. What if we give those traders guns, tell them to enslave a shitload of more people, and start importing slaves by literally the hundreds of thousands and bringing them to Brazil exclusively to grow sugarcane? So when we observe that slavery and slaving had existed in Africa prior to European arrival, do not let that blind you from the fact that once Europeans tap into that, there is incredible qualitative and quantitative change. And what Europeans do in the New World is something that had never been done before in world history. Slavery had existed in societies from China to India to Greece to Rome. But never before had a people systematically enslaved millions of other people, defined slavery as being a racial and chattel system, and then exclusively used millions of those slaves to grow for the explicit and sole purpose of growing cash crops. That is brand new. And the increase, the quantitative change is dramatic once you have that European demand. It never would have happened without the massive increase in demand for slaves that Europeans bring. And it's not just the Portuguese, the Spanish and the French and the British all follow suit. And we're talking about over the course of the 1700s alone. And you know that the first slaves arrived in America long before that. But in the 1700s alone, 6 million human beings in a state of bondage are taken from Africa and brought across the Atlantic Ocean and into the New World. That's massive quantitative change. When I mean by qualitative, it means what is the nature of something? Root word quality, not like good or bad, but what's it like? What is the nature of it? Again, it is something new. Racial, chattel slavery, exclusively to grow cash crops. That's not what slavery had been in Africa or in the Muslim world. I think the next map is substantially similar but does a little bit better job showing you the point of origin of these people and where they end up. In this class, we are, of course, primarily concerned with Britain's North American colonies. But understand, of those 6 million people, only about 500,000 end up in Britain's North American colonies. That means the vast majority, 5.5 million, end up somewhere else. And if you look at this pie chart, you can see it's one of two places. Either Brazil or the West Indies or the Caribbean. So most people enslaved and brought to the New World are going to end up on a sugar plantation either in Brazil or the Caribbean. But also throughout the Spanish New World and Britain's North American colonies, in that case mostly in the southern ones. In terms of where these people come from, you can see here too, there's two big chunks. One is the Bight of Benin I alluded to earlier right here. And the other would be the combined areas for the purposes of this pie chart of Congo and Angola. The bulk of the rest would come from West Africa, to the west of the Bight of Benin. Senegambia, Sierra Leone, Ivory Coast, Gold Coast, what's nowadays Ghana. Brought to the New World in inhumane conditions of bondage, packed into slaving ships as commodities. Understand that even the most cold-hearted, despicable slave running merchant had a vested interest in slaves staying alive because they are valuable property to him. Even given that fact, the average death rate on these journeys was something like 15% because of the squalid conditions in filth and sickness and human excrement that could be found in the hold of these ships. Whereon slaves occasionally revolted, once or twice with success, but of course it only takes a few instances like that for slavers to go the extra miles to protect themselves, with even installing cannons that would shoot grape shot if anyone attempted to rush the front of the ship where the captain would be. If there was an outbreak of disease on these ships, sometimes the death rate could get up to 40, 50%. But those who survived that middle passage, or those that came from the Caribbean, most of them ended up on rice or tobacco plantations. Now we know that the average slave owner in those southern colonies only owned a few slaves. It was not common for a slave owner to have dozens or hundreds of slaves. But some of the ones who did had 200, 300. Down in the low country, you could have some rice plantations with over 300 slaves. And so, numerically speaking, the odds for the slave, that enslaved person, is probably going to end up on one of these big plantations. Where during this time, historians have done a good job of showing us that American slavery looks a lot different depending on not just where you're looking, but when. And I stress, during this time, there was an incredible amount of diversity on these plantations. What I mean is not like diversity of color. I mean, you could have a single tobacco or rice plantation, if it was one of the big ones, where there could be enslaved persons that were born on the plantation. Maybe even their parents were born on the plantation. And they grew up speaking English and were familiar. This was their home, their country. They probably knew something of their ancestors and of their heritage, but nonetheless, this is where they were born. On that same plantation, you could have people in the same condition, but who have a different heritage, a different background, ancestors that didn't come from Congo, but that came from Senegambia. And at the same time, on the very same plantation, you could have someone who had been brought into the colony from an existing plantation in the Caribbean, maybe not even a British one. You could have somebody who was born in Haiti or Saint-Domingue and grew up speaking French. whose ancestors came from somewhere different still than those other two people. You could have people who came from the British colonies in the Caribbean who spoke English, but nonetheless were not born there in, say, Georgia or South Carolina or Virginia. And at the still very same time, you could have brand new slaves brought over by the Middle Passage directly from, say, Sierra Leone or from Angola, who spoke, their original language still and had been brought immediately over upon their enslavement in their homeland. And other than the color of their skin, which could also be different, but their legal status as the color of their skin and their enslavement did not have a whole lot in common. Now, eventually that would change. The United States stops the importation of slaves from abroad simply because the slave population was self-reproducing at such a tremendous rate. We did not have to import slaves anymore. But that's after the Revolution. My point is simply that there would not always be this kind of incredible diversity of people on American plantations. But certainly there was during this time. As there was resistance, there are a very few examples of actual rebellion. I'll get to one of those in a second. There are some instances, more numerous but still limited, of slaves running away, which they sometimes could do successfully, but very often not. And usually that was met if you were caught with severe punishment, often severe physical punishment, often in the form of making sure that you could not ever physically run again. And what's more common is what historians call everyday resistance. Little things that maybe don't seem like a big deal to us looking back, but certainly would have both to that individual and sort of collectively as a way of a sort of metaphorical release valve of letting off steam and reducing the number of potentially deadly instances of resistance like running away and rebelling. Everyday resistance could be anything from refusing to work, pretending to be sick or crazy, to always rejecting this notion that you were a person with a price or a commodity, and just a simple belief in your own humanity and various forms of expressing that, culturally speaking, in song perhaps, to sabotaging things on the plantation when no one was looking that you could get away with it. Poisoning somebody's food if you thought you could get away with it, that kind of thing. That would be obviously more serious if you were caught. But these are things that historians would call, again, everyday resistance. And there is major resistance. There is one major attempt at a slave rebellion in these 13 colonies, specifically the Stono Rebellion, where some slaves in South Carolina escaped the plantation, had killed the white slave owners on the plantation, and broken into a country store and gotten some guns and headed south. Sort of stopping at a plantation or two here and there to free the slaves there, but not with the purpose of, as we'll see with a later example with a man named Nat Turner, who would later go to each plantation to kill the slave owners and free the slaves, to build a slave army and attempt at a mass rebellion of the kind that would occur later in Haiti and be successful. This is a little bit different. They were just trying to get the hell out of there and to get south from South Carolina into what was at the time Spanish Florida. Spain, in quotation marks, controlled Florida. What I mean by that is they controlled St. Augustine and Pensacola, but not a hell of a lot more between now. Like the interior of Florida was Indian country. And slaves knew that, and when they ran away successfully, they could get into that Indian country, live amongst the Native Americans in what we call maroon colonies, like at Fort Mose. Fort Mose is just outside of St. Augustine in modern-day Jacksonville, in the northeast of Florida. It was known that there was a maroon community there, and that if you could escape, you knew the Spanish didn't have control of that Floridian interior, and that the Native Americans would welcome you and take you in probably. Regrettably, these people did not make it. South Carolina calls up a militia that is able to track them down, and they are executed and made an example of, to send the signal to others to not even bother to attempt it. And indeed, until Nat Turner, with maybe off the top of my head one exception I can think of, there were not to be any more major slave rebellions. In other words, chattel slavery was there to stay. Are there any questions about this or anything else? That was 1739, by the way, I should have said. Anything else? Well, that's all I got. So, have a great rest of your week and weekend.